The Ratchet PS2 trilogy of games is still seen as the best representative of what makes this series so special for its fans. Each one of these has standout characteristics that can make any one of them a person's favorite, depending on whom you ask. The first one nailed the landing right out of the gate, but it didn't include strafing, which is seen as an essential part to the series formula. The second one added strafing, which set the bar for each subsequent game, and the third one introduced us to the main villain that has been a staple ever since. So, which of these games stands the test of time as the best one, now that the series has been around for almost 20 years? I'm JoystickDrummer, and welcome to a series I'm calling Tri-Analysis. This is a trilogy analysis on the Ratchet Clank PS2 trilogy, where I try and analyze which one is the best out of the three. Okay, let's get to it. These games are some of the very few that include and execute so many different staples of multiple genres and games, creating a truly one-of-a-kind experience. It combines the platforming and the close combat of the action-adventure genre with the backtracking found in Metroidvanias and those insane traversal gadgets found in the Zelda series. Each one of these is fine-tuned to work seamlessly within the Ratchet & Clank universe, while also being accompanied by their own original ideas, like grind rail sections. These make going from point A to B a cinematic spectacle that also tests the player's reflexes to make sure they're still paying attention. There's also truly creative weapons that really make you question what the devs were smoking when they thought of the Sheepinator. Combine that with a sense of teenage humor that doesn't pander to children, and you get one of the greatest PS2 trilogies of all time. With all that out of the way, let's start where it all began. This first game is a platformer first, and a shooter second, but the director Ted Price really didn't want this game to be called a platformer.
Yeah, this is
What do you call it?
Our intent, well, we tried to avoid calling it a platformer, but then the press started calling it a platformer, and then that it stuck.
There's jumping.
There's jumping,
You jump
for
from
sure.
platform to platform sometimes.
There are moving platforms, but we were trying to, by adding the guns, by adding an inventory system, giving it RPG elements, we're really trying to distance ourselves from what we thought people thought platformers were, which were collectathons.
For trying so hard not to have Ratchet & Clank be called a platformer, they implemented everything that makes the genre stand out. The aerial traversal is smooth and not too floaty, you are given multiple ways to speed through the level, and even the enemies require you to master the basics of jumping in order to avoid some of their attacks. I can still keep going! The swing shot and the grind boots offer up different styles of traversal that are so simple in design, but offer the player a momentary break away from all the constant action. You then can just simply focus on making your way through the obstacle course. Okay. We are also given a Hydro Pack upgrade for Clank, which is ultimately used to test the player on a time challenge that leaves little room for error. We have to dodge moving lasers and swim through multiple rings, all before time expires? Okay, I'm done now, I swear. All these different gadgets serve one purpose, and that's to make the transition between traversal and combat as seamless as possible. The later games started to steer away from the platforming aspect and focus mostly on combat, but not here. Almost every single level has a path dedicated for traversal only, and this immensely helps with breaking up the pacing of each section. They usually lead to a new item or a collectible, but you never venture down a path without getting rewarded for your exploration.
Yes!
I always try to go down these paths first, because when you see enemies ahead, that's usually the fastest way to the end of the level. These paths aren't super challenging, but it gives you that breather to mess around with the movement mechanics, and man is the traversal satisfying. You can swing to a point with a swing shot, and then hover down to the original platform if you flub your jump. This hovering mechanic feels exactly like the glider from Breath of the Wild, and we all know how great that felt. Your robot sidekick Clank is the guy that's helping you pull off these satisfying maneuvers, and you also get a long jump and a high jump to round out your movement set. You know, I think that's the reason why I love this gameplay so much. The game is always encouraging you to keep moving, whether you're in combat or exploring every possible path down each level. But the game also encourages you to explore at your own pace and never forces you to do everything all at once. There's no waypoint telling you where to go next, so you, yes you, have to figure out exactly where to go next. And sometimes what you discover is that you don't have the necessary item to progress forward. This is where the Metroidvania aspects come in. If you have to go back and find a necessary item, the game helps guide you towards which planet to check first. Once you open the planet select screen, you get a checklist of all the paths that you still need to go down on each of the previous planets. It doesn't tell you exactly where to go, but you don't have to search every single square inch of each previous planet, and that really helps make this backtracking not feel tedious. Actually hitting these roadblocks is exhilarating to me, and it's kind of funny when you think about exactly what these are. When you boil it down, this is basically just a simple fetch quest where you go grab an item to go solve a problem. Those are always the worst missions in any game, but this time you're obtaining a traversal item, like the Magna Boots, instead of just getting something meaningless that has nothing to do with the story. This actually serves like a moment to breathe throughout the game, while gently nudging you towards exploration instead of just constantly pushing you past everything. There is nothing worse than exploring a new path only to reach a dead end or find a chest that obtains an item that you already have 50 of after you already took the time to traverse this new area. Being able to reward the player with something useful just because they decided to check out a different path is the definition of my shit. It really does seem like Insomniac thought of every single frustration a player might run into and implemented a solution right before the game shipped. Well, that is everything except the aiming system. I'll be the first to admit that the aiming system of having to stand still and aim down the sights really doesn't work for a game that is trying to keep you constantly moving. There was a solution in the later games where they introduced strafing, but Insomniac thought of a different solution in this game. So you have the bigger guys that usually stand in the back and a cluster of smaller enemies that swarm you. These smaller enemies don't just charge you head on, but they circle around you in order to teach you to use your wrench or the pyroster to get yourself out of this tricky situation. After you've destroyed these smaller nuisances, all you have to do is run up to the bigger guys and whack them with your wrench, and now you've solved this combat scenario. Once they start introducing the bigger enemies, you're highly encouraged to use either the Visibomb or the Devastator to take them out. And this leads you to two different scenarios, either frustration or grinding the pacing to a halt. The most optimal way to take out these bigger ships is to fire off the Visibomb and just steer it at the damn thing. Fortunately, these two weapons fire off relatively quickly, so you're not out of the action for too long as to make yourself anxious about being vulnerable to enemy attacks. This gets the job done, but because of the inconsistent auto lock-on, it's just so much easier to aim these weapons in first-person mode. You're sacrificing the safety of being able to see Ratchet in order to take down the enemy that's blocking your path. This auto lock-on system also makes one of the early weapons more frustrating to use than rewarding. The blaster is just a weapon I don't use anymore in my playthroughs because it just can't be used effectively. You have to hope that you and the enemy are standing perfectly still and that you're aimed directly at them for it to be of any use. Well, that doesn't usually happen, with these swarms of smaller enemies always charging you. This problem did get fixed with the introduction of strafing in the later games, but with all the other useful weapons that you have at your disposal, there's just no reason to even use the blaster. That's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about gameplay-wise with the first Ratchet game. So now let's talk about the greatest innovation to this series, the ability to strafe. This was introduced in Ratchet & Clank 2, and by holding down the left or right bumper, you can move side to side while still looking forward. It gives you greater control over your movement in the battlefield by making the ability to run and aim much easier. With this newfound freedom of movement, the developers were able to change how the enemies tried to kill you. There are now more baddies that fire projectiles at you that you have to dodge, and the amount of enemies that appear on screen all at once has greatly increased. With a larger focus on making combat the focus instead of traversal, Commando introduced a battle arena. You can throw in wave after wave of multiple enemies, and you are truly tested on how effectively you can adapt to this new combat style. This battle arena really wouldn't have worked in the first game, and this is where strafing truly starts to shine. Enemies are more focused at rushing you head on instead of firing at you from afar, so your new strategy is to mow them down as quickly as possible. Strafing really does add a lot in the combat department, but running around a circle and just decimating anything is just so satisfying to me compared to this new style of running and gunning. You still have to keep moving, but instead of vertically jumping around to avoid attacks, it's just been shifted to horizontal movement. This works incredibly well, but I just prefer the movement in the first game. Since strafing was such a major improvement to the combat experience, they also changed the enemies, and I found them to be way more annoying this time around. It's not like it's a major change, because there are still enemies that stand in one spot and fire at you, and they're easy to manage, if they're kept in small groupings. They become a major annoyance once they throw dozens and dozens at you, and that level is called Snivelic. I talked about this level in my Ratchet 2 video, and I still stand by what I said about this horrible level. Basically, you're breaking into this guy's base of operations, so I knew it wasn't going to be easy to get inside, but holy shit, is it unforgivingly hard. You have multiple moving lasers to account for, while also being shot at by 5 different guys, all at the same time. Then you have to face this giant ship, but you can't get too close because its missiles are nearly impossible to dodge. Then you get these giant laser walls that block you in place until you clear out everyone. And then guess what happens after that? You're greeted by 2 more of the giant ships right after you got out of the force fields. It was so frustrating, getting so close each time, only to die, and then you have to do it all over again. The only way I made it through was that I was lucky enough to have my health upgrade a second before I was about to die, which gave me a full health bar. Once you finally get through everything, you get to fight the worst boss I've ever fought in any video game. And you could just watch my Ratchet 2 video if you want to see how frustrated I got with him. Really, the only other major improvements made to Ratchet 2 was the inclusion of RPG mechanics, like your health and weapons upgrading during combat. These actually give you an incentive to use every single weapon that you can buy, because you just never know what the weapon's going to turn into. I actually find that I use more weapons in this game than the first one, because I can see that little progress bar fill up. I definitely only use my favorite weapons when replaying the first game, because there's no incentive to use anything else. These RPG mechanics were actually a really great thing to add to the formula, but that was the only thing that was worth adding. I thought the forced flying missions were way too boring, and they really disrupted the pacing a little too much. The giant Clank segments were just kind of button mashers, and I really could have done without a second racing segment. Ratchet 2 and 3 are usually held up as the favorites of this trilogy, but they're just lacking some charm that's found in the first game.
Son of a quark!
Okay, let's move on to Ratchet and Clank 3. Up your arsenal. From what I hear on the Ratchet and Clank subreddit, the multiplayer game mode was a big factor for some fans calling this one their favorite. But since it's no longer around and I never got a chance to play it, I'm not going to be talking about it in this video. The only other big additions in this third entry were 2D side-scrolling missions where you play as Quark and minor vehicle levels, but these weren't the most popular additions. This game leaned heavily into the combat portions, so much so that it seems like the platforming side of Ratchet and Clank just seems to be forgotten here. There are very few instances where platforming is even required to advance, because most of the levels rely heavily on combat sections, and even some of the worlds are combat missions only, where you can't even explore the surrounding area. Each world having those multiple paths are all but gone here, except for a few levels, and there's not even one single grind rail section in this game. After replaying all 3 of these games for like the 10th time now, I realized that the platforming sections are what made me fall in love with this series. The combat is amazing in all 3 of these games, but the lack of strafing in the first game really does make it hard to go back to if you played any of the other entries first. You know, that's what I've come to realize about these games. If you played any other entry besides the first one first, it's almost impossible to go back and play a Ratchet game without strafing included. I may think that the first one juggled combat and platforming way better than the other 2, but there is one thing that all 3 of these games did perfectly, and those are their TV ads. I remember seeing these commercials while watching TV as a kid, and they perfectly sold the tone of these games in each one of them. They all showed off a different gadget, and it always ended the same way, with something going hilariously wrong.
Oh man!
The one I vividly remember though was for the decoy glove.
That is Corey. He's helping us with our inflatable decoy test for Ratchet and Clank. Oh, man.
Yeah, that was banned from TV. Insomniac knew how to get people excited for their games, and the hilarious tone of each one of these commercials translates perfectly to how the characters act in the universe. The first Ratchet game portrays the relationship between the two of them very differently than the future installments, but that's to be expected to show some genuine character progression. He only has this attitude in the first game, but by the end of it, he develops a true connection with Clank, showing us a nice little character progression arc. But the director, Ted Price, really sees this first game as kinda cringy. But I don't get how, because in the other two entries, there is way more cringe than in the first one. There's a reason why they brought Skid McMarks back for the third game, and not the mathematician.
Watch your mouth, Zero, before the mathematician subtracts your head from your shoulders!
I can't see how anyone finds that funny, because the joke is just right in front of your face, and it really makes it feel like a 6-year-old writing their first comic series. Skid McMarks works so well because he's not a talking piece of shit. That's just his name. I didn't even understand the joke with his name until I replayed the games in my 20s, and I can't believe a joke like that flew right over my head. The first game just had that teenage smartass humor that I love, and I still miss it to this day. Like, come on, how are you gonna tell me that this is cringy?
And blast it!
Look, plumber's crack.
What did you just say?
I said, look, the plumber's back.
All right, wise guy.
The lack of edginess and actually taking a step towards cringiness in the future games really had me wondering.
All right, just what the is going on?
God, it's so not funny. Thankfully, the third game got the main villain right, but they still tried to one-up themselves by adding the most unfunny thing into the series so far. They're talking burps. I will admit that Ratchet does go a little too far with the teenage angst in the first game, but that humor is supposed to appeal to teenagers, while this appeals to 2-year-olds. The devs may think the humor hasn't aged well, but they certainly got all three of the main villains correct. Quick heads up, there's about to be spoilers for 20-year-old games in 3, 2, 1. Drek, Quark, and Nefarious are all top-tier villains that each have a fleshed-out plan for their evil doings. This isn't just a surface level, I'm evil just because that's who I am, but something that has a lot of thought behind it. Chairman Drek, he's taking pieces from each planet in the galaxy in order to create one true perfect planet, thus draining the resources from all the existing planets. We find out that he's doing this because his homeworld has been turned into an inhabitable toxic wasteland due to pollution. And I bet you can already guess who caused that pollution. The way Drek benefits from this is that he can sell access to this perfect planet and then slowly start to pollute it again, starting the cycle all over again. It's a very real concept, polluting a planet until it's uninhabitable. The only difference with us is that we won't have enough time to get off this Earth before Mother Nature kills the disease that is humanity. For Ratchet 2, Captain Quark is the main villain, but we didn't know that because he's disguised as the person that we're trying to help the whole time. You see, after Ratchet embarrassed Quark in the first game, he came up with a plan to get his reputation back by saving another galaxy from a problem he creates. It's a very Quark thing to do, but the reveal at the end kinda comes out of left field, and it definitely feels like it was a last-minute addition. Ratchet 3 has the best villain though, with Dr. Nefarious. He has such an iconic voice, and is just so comically evil, but he has a good reason for that. See, Captain Quark knocked Nefarious into a pool of lava, and so he had to be rebuilt as a robot lifeform. He hates Quark for this, so as payback, he wants to turn all lifeforms into robots in order to control the entire galaxy. They also gave him one of the greatest malfunctions, where if he gets too worked up, he freezes in place, and audio from a soap opera starts to play from his head. It's just one of those additions into the game that really helps sell the charm of it.
That's what makes it so good, Janice. Feel it. My heart is pounding like an anvil.
With each of these bosses' personalities out of the way, let's talk about the final thing I want to cover, and that's the final boss fights. The ending to Ratchet 1 was kind of divisive, and I didn't know that before I started digging into the subreddit. It's my favorite one out of the three. But the difficulty does spike here, and a lot of people have voiced some disdain for this finale. Once you're facing Drek inside the giant robot one-on-one, his moveset is so diverse. He can launch missiles all over the battlefield, create minions, launch landmines, and shoot AoE bombs. His moveset definitely creates some urgency with this fight, and there are multiple times in this battle where you have to slam down on a giant button in order to stop a countdown. After you stop the countdown, he comes charging right at you with an electric shield, and this is when you have to use the railing around the arena to get away from him. There's a lot that happens very quickly in this fight, so I totally understand how it could be overwhelming for some, but that's the reason why I love it. It's a great final challenge that isn't unfair with its difficulty, and it wasn't solely focused on combat. To even get to the final arena, you have to traverse some tricky platforming that tests you on everything that you've learned so far throughout your journey. It's one of those rare boss fights where it's not too unfair or too easy where it becomes boring. No, Ratchet 2 holds that honor. The final boss for that game is a giant proto-pet that Quark foolishly creates in an attempt to save the day, only to get eaten by it. The giant ball just rolls around and vomits out tinier versions of itself, but it doesn't even pose a significant threat because its attacks are so easily dodged. The rolling is so easily telegraphed, and when you get the boss's health low, it really doesn't do anything. It just smashes the floor and you fall down to the next level. It doesn't make the fight any harder. The only thing you have to worry about is your ammo, because this thing is a bullet sponge. The devs specifically made this fight easier after hearing all the feedback from the direct fight, but I think they went too far with it and made the fight way too easy. Luckily, they didn't do this with Nefarious. He mainly focuses on shooting lasers or missiles at you, but once you get to the second phase, you have to start dodging shadow clones of him. You were constantly moving in a circle in order to avoid his attacks, but one of his moves is to create random clones of himself, and the only useful strategy I've found to dodge those is to just keep side flipping and touching the ground as little as possible. There's one final phase to this fight. Nefarious gets in a giant mech suit, and all you have to do is just fly around and shoot at him, but this part is very easy and straightforward. All you have to do is keep flying left or right and firing at him, and you pretty much won.
Oh, the humiliation! Defeated by squishes! Oh, I'll never live this down!
So that's all three boss fights. So let's wrap this video up. If I had to rank these three games, I would go first, second, third. I just like the general aesthetic of Ratchet in the first game more than any of the other ones. He's just a shirtless dude running around whacking his wrench on people. I probably should have phrased that better. What I'm trying to say is, he's just a normal dude that happens to go on an adventure to save his home. Instead of being the hero for hire when another galaxy needs help, Ratchet is just Ratchet. The first one also has way more platforming in it than the other two, and that's something I've wanted to see a return of, and Rift Apart did an amazing job with that. The second and third aren't bad by any means. There are just some areas that I find annoying with the second one that make me really not want to replay it, and the lack of any real traversal or exploration in the third one makes my decision to say the first one is my favorite a lot easier. But that's just my opinion on these three games, and if you've made it this far in the video, I want to hear your opinion about these three games down in the comments. While you're scrolling down there, there's two buttons you have to scroll past, and it would really mean a lot if you could click either of them. Thank you guys so much for watching to the end. If you want to see anything else I've done, there's probably some links on screen right now, but before that, here's a 20-second drum solo.